The silence in Cascade Whisper National Park had different flavors. There was the deep, respectful hush of the old-growth groves, where thousand-year-old Douglas firs drank the sound from the air. There was the sharp, expectant silence before a storm, when the very needles on the hemlocks seemed to hold their breath. And then there was the silence I was walking through now, a dead, flat quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held-back scream. I ran a gloved hand over the trail marker, checking the wood for rot. Post 7B, North Ridge Trail. All clear. My job, for the most part, was a series of quiet, solitary checks like this. A life measured in miles of damp earth and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. My name is Ezra Quaid. I'm a park ranger, 31 years old, and for the last 5 years, Cascade Whisper has been my office, my church, and my home. I took the job to escape the noise of Seattle, to trade concrete for granite and the drone of traffic for the rush of the Skycomish River. It was a practical choice. The fact that this park bordered the Salish River Reservation where my mother was born was a coincidence I chose to ignore. I was a man of observable facts: weather patterns, wildlife tracks, trail erosion. The stories my grandmother used to tell me, tales of spirits that slumbered in the mountains and shadows that hunted in the deep woods, were just that: stories. Folklore. The charming, primitive superstitions of a people my father's world had left behind. The big event on everyone's calendar was the impending lunar eclipse, a full-blown blood moon. The park had seen a small uptick in visitors. Amateur astronomers with telescopes that cost more than my truck, and New Age types hoping to realign their energy or whatever. To me, it just meant more potential for lost hikers and illegal campfires. Another line item on my daily report. My boss, a perpetually stressed man named Henderson, had been harping on it for weeks. Quaid, double-check the lookouts. Make sure the signage for the unstable cliffs is visible. The last thing we need is some tourist chasing a cosmic photo op off a ledge. I was heading back to my patrol truck when my satellite phone buzzed in my chest pocket. The display read Jonah, my great-uncle. I leaned against the rough bark of a western red cedar and answered, "Hey, Uncle. Everything okay?" His voice came through crackly, thin as autumn leaves. "Ezra, you are listening?" "I'm here, Jonah. What's up?" "The sky bleeds soon. The moon will weep blood for the mountain." I sighed, a quiet puff of condensation in the cool air. Here we go. "The eclipse, yeah, should be quite a show." "It is no show," he rasped, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made the hair on my arms prickle despite my skepticism. "It is an opening. An old door swings wide. When the time comes, you keep your eyes from Scarred Rock. Do you hear me, boy? The spirits that sleep there. They wake with a hunger on a night like this, a hunger for warmth, for life." Scarred Rock was a massive granite monolith in the park's most remote and rugged sector, a place officially closed to hikers due to frequent rock slides. It was named for a huge, dark fissure that ran down its face like an old wound. To the Salish River people, it was a sacred, feared place. To the U.S. Geological Survey, it was a chunk of Mesozoic granite. I knew which definition I trusted. "I hear you, Uncle," I said, trying to keep my tone patient. I loved the old man, but his world was one of smoke and stories, of a reality I couldn't touch or measure. "I'll be careful. I'm mostly sticking to the main trails anyway. Henderson's got us on tourist duty." "The tourists do not know the rules," Jonah insisted, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "They will walk where they shouldn't. They will make noise. and the hounds will hear them." "Hounds?" I asked, my brow furrowing. That was a new one. A long, static-filled pause. "Just stay away from the rock, Ezra, promise me. For your grandmother's memory, promise me." The mention of my grandmother was a low blow. He knew it was my weak spot. "I promise, Uncle Jonah. I'll stay clear of the restricted zones. Now I've got to go. Radio check-in is in 5. "Be well," he said, and the line went dead. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the old man's words leaving a strange residue in the quiet air. "The hounds will hear them." It sounded like the title of a cheap horror novel. I shook my head, dismissing it. He was old. He was traditional. It's what he did. I finished my patrol, the afternoon light turning a soft gold as it filtered through the canopy. I saw a herd of black-tailed deer, a bald eagle circling high above the valley, and a black bear cub tumbling through a patch of huckleberry bushes. These were the things that were real, tangible. The park was a complex, beautiful ecosystem, not a haunted house. That evening in my small, state-issued cabin, I ate a can of chili and watched the moon rise over the jagged peaks. It was huge and unnaturally bright, a silver dollar in an indigo sky. The forecast called for clear skies, perfect for the celestial show. My radio crackled with the occasional chatter from the other rangers, mostly reports of minor infractions, a campfire too close to a tent, a car parked in a no-parking zone. Normalcy. I thought of Jonah's call. An old door swings wide. It was easy to see how these mountains could inspire such stories. In the dead of night, the wind sighing through the pines could sound like a whisper. The snap of a twig in the underbrush could become the footstep of something ancient. The human mind was built to see patterns, to create narratives where there were none. It was a survival mechanism that had outlived its usefulness. Before turning in, I stepped out onto my porch. The air was cold, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The moon was higher now, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced like living things. Far in the distance, a lone wolf howled, a mournful, lonely sound that echoed off the granite walls of the valley. It was a sound I'd heard 1,000 times. But tonight, for the first time, it didn't feel like a wild animal calling to its pack. It felt like a warning. I shivered, pulled my jacket tighter, and told myself it was just the cold. The call came in at 800 hours, just as I was pouring my second cup of coffee. It was Henderson, his voice tight with the forced calm of a man trying to keep a lid on a boiling pot. "Quaid, we've got a situation. A car has been parked at the trailhead for the Forbidden Zone near Scarred Rock since yesterday afternoon. A blue Subaru. Belongs to a Dylan and Marissa Vance. They were due back in Seattle last night. Family reported them missing an hour ago. My stomach went cold. They went up toward the rock? Looks that way. Their hiking permit application was for the Sawtooth Loop, but the Subaru is miles from that trailhead. They went off plan. I need you to gear up and head out there. Standard search and rescue protocol. Look for a tent, any sign of their trail. Keep your radio on." "Copy that," I said, my mind replaying Jonah's warning. They will walk where they shouldn't. Coincidence. It had to be. The drive to the trailhead was tense. The morning mist clung to the valleys, thick and white, making the giant cedars look like gray ghosts. The air was still heavy with that same dead quiet from yesterday. I parked my truck behind the Subaru, its paint job an offensively cheerful blue against the muted greens and browns of the forest. I started my search, following the faint trail that snaked away from the official path and into the restricted sector. This was old logging country, and the path was overgrown, choked with ferns and devil's club. It was clear Dylan and Marissa weren't experienced hikers. They'd left obvious signs: a broken branch here, a scuffed patch of moss there. Clumsy, loud. The thought made my skin crawl. After about 2 miles of steady climbing, I found their campsite. It was nestled in a small clearing dominated by a colossal Douglas fir, a true ancient of the woods, its trunk at least 10 feet in diameter. The tent, a small 2-person dome, was zipped shut.
"Dylan? Marissa?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Park Ranger! Is anyone here?" Silence.
I unzipped the tent flap. Inside it was a mess. Sleeping bags were unrolled and tangled. A paperback book lay face down, its spine broken. A headlamp was on, its beam a pale, ghostly circle on the nylon wall. Their backpacks were there, half unpacked. A bag of trail mix had spilled across the floor. It looked like they'd left in a hurry, but there were no signs of a struggle. No ripped fabric, no blood. Critically, their boots were gone, so they'd left on foot. I exited the tent and began a circular search of the clearing. That's when I noticed 2 things that were profoundly wrong. The first was the complete and utter lack of animal sign. No deer tracks, no squirrel chatter from the branches, no bird song. It was as if a 50-foot wide bubble of absolute sterility had been dropped around this campsite. Even the insects were silent. I'd spent my entire adult life in the wilderness, and I had never experienced anything like it. Nature is never truly silent. This was a vacuum, a wrongness. The second thing was on the trunk of the giant fir. About 7 feet off the ground, etched deep into the thick, furrowed bark, were 3 parallel gouges. I ran my fingers over them. They were wide, deep, and had splintered the ancient wood. My first thought was a bear. But a bear's claw marks are usually 4 or 5, and they're closer together, made as the animal tries to climb. Furthermore, a bear would have shredded that tent to get at the food inside. These marks were different. They weren't made by an animal trying to climb or find food. They looked deliberate, like something had casually tested the sharpness of its talons. 3 of them. Huge. I circled the tree, my heart thumping a heavy, nervous rhythm against my ribs. On the other side, away from the tent, I found them. Footprints. 2 sets. One clearly from a man's hiking boot, the other a woman's. Dylan and Marissa. They were headed deeper into the woods, away from the trail, moving fast. The prints were deep in the soft, damp soil, the strides long and erratic. They were running, but they weren't alone. Alongside their tracks was a 3rd set of prints. They were barefoot, impossibly large and vaguely canine, but wrong in every proportion. The pads were too long, the shape too narrow, and where the claws should have been, there were just deep, sharp punctures in the earth, as if the creature was walking on 3-inch spikes. They weren't the tracks of any animal I knew. They didn't belong in any textbook. They looked like something a Hollywood special effects artist would dream up for a monster movie. My pragmatic, rational mind scrambled for an explanation. A prank? Some local yahoos in costume trying to scare tourists? But the depth of the print suggested immense weight, and the gouges in the tree. No prankster could do that. I followed the tracks for another 100 yards until they reached a rocky outcrop where the trail vanished. The boot prints were frantic, slipping and sliding on the mossy stones. The other prints were steady, deliberate, and perfectly spaced. It wasn't a chase. It was a herding. I got on the radio, my voice huskier than I intended. "Henderson, this is Quaid. I've found the campsite. It's abandoned. No signs of a struggle, but I've got some anomalous tracks here." Very large, non-native predator. Possibly. Possibly? Henderson's voice crackled back, sharp with irritation. What does that mean, Quaid? Is it a cougar? A grizzly? Negative. I can't identify it. The tracks are canine but bipedal. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could picture him pinching the bridge of his nose. Bipedal. Right, just follow the trail, Quaid. Standard procedure. And don't go spooking yourself with campfire stories. The condescension in his tone was a familiar sting, but this time it didn't matter. I was already spooked. I looked up at the sky where the sun was beginning its slow descent. The eclipse was tonight. My great-uncle's words echoed in my head, no longer sounding like foolish superstition, but like a chilling, precise prophecy. The hounds will hear them. I gripped the stock of the tranquilizer rifle slung over my shoulder. Somehow I had a feeling that whatever made those tracks, a dart full of carfentanil, wasn't going to be enough to stop it. Hours bled into one another. I followed the trail of panicked boot prints and monstrous tracks deeper into the forbidden zone, pushing through thickets of salmonberry that tore at my clothes and scrambling over moss-slicked boulders. The sun, a weak disk of white, began its slow, inexorable slide toward the western peaks. The light in the forest grew dim, shifting from a clear, crisp green to a murky, bruised purple. The air grew colder, the dampness seeping into my bones. There was still no sign of Dylan and Marissa. No scrap of clothing, no dropped water bottle, nothing. They had simply been swallowed by the woods. The tracks led me to the edge of a steep ravine, the Skycomish River roaring 100 feet below. Here, the boot prints stopped abruptly. The strange, three-toed tracks, however, continued, walking calmly right to the precipice, and then vanishing. It was as if the creature had simply stepped off into thin air. My stomach churned. It made no sense. Nothing about this day made sense. By the time I'd circled the ravine and picked up the trail again, or what was left of it, the sky was turning a sickly shade of orange. The eclipse was beginning. The moon, invisible in the daylight, was starting to take a bite out of the sun. The world was growing darker, but not in the gentle way of a normal sunset. This was a strange, oppressive twilight, a draining of color and warmth from the landscape. Then the fog rolled in. It didn't drift. It surged up from the valleys like a silent white tide, consuming the forest in minutes. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The colossal trees became vague, looming shapes in the gloom. The temperature plummeted. It was a classic Cascade Mountain whiteout, the kind that could get even the most experienced outdoorsman killed. My radio crackled to life. It was Henderson. "Quaid, what's your position? The chopper's grounded, the fog's too thick. You need to pull back. Now. We'll resume at first light." I stood there, the cold mist swirling around me, the silence of the forest a physical weight. Pull back? Leave Dylan and Marissa out here in this? With that thing? "Negative, Henderson," I said, my voice firm. "I'm close to the ridge overlooking Scarred Rock. I have a bad feeling about this. I'm going to check it out."
"Absolutely not," he barked. "That's an order, Ranger."
"The conditions are too dangerous. I'm not losing a ranger on top of 2 tourists. Get back to your vehicle." "I remember a story my grandmother used to tell," I said, speaking more to myself than to him. The words came unbidden, dredged up from a part of my memory I thought was long buried. She said that sometimes the rock weeps. "What the hell are you talking about, Quaid?" "I'm just going to check the ridge. It's the last high ground vantage point. I'll be careful. Quaid out. I switched off the radio before he could reply, severing my link to the sane, orderly world. The decision was irrational, a direct violation of protocol and common sense. It wasn't driven by logic, but by a cold, hard knot of dread in my gut. An instinct inherited from a long line of people who knew these mountains in a way I was only just beginning to understand. I was alone now. Truly alone. I unslung the tranquilizer rifle from my shoulder, the weight of it a small comfort. It was a state-of-the-art piece of equipment, a capture model designed to take down a 1,300-pound bull moose. I checked the CO2 cartridge and the dart loaded with a potent opioid cocktail. Beside it, on my belt, was my sidearm, a standard-issue Glock. Tools of a world that operated on the principles of biology and physics. I prayed they would be enough. From my pack, I pulled my high-lumen flashlight, its beam cutting a solid, unwavering cone through the roiling fog. The world shrank to the small circle of light at my feet. Every drip of water from a fern frond, every skittering beetle, sounded like a thunderclap in the unnatural stillness. The darkness was gathering, not just from the setting sun, but from the encroaching shadow of the moon. The sky above the fog was no longer orange, but a deep, bruised red, the color of old blood. The light filtering through the mist cast everything in a hellish, crimson glow. My own hands, holding the flashlight, looked like they'd been dipped in paint. The final ascent to the ridge was brutal, a near-vertical climb up a slope of loose scree and tangled roots. My lungs burned and my legs ached. The fog was so thick I could barely see the ground beneath my feet. I navigated by instinct, by the feel of the mountain's incline. I kept thinking of Jonah's frantic warning, of the impossible tracks, of the eerie silence. The skeptical, pragmatic part of my brain was screaming that I was being a fool, chasing ghosts because of some old family legends. But another, deeper part of me, a part that had been dormant my entire life, knew I was walking toward a terrible truth. Finally, the ground leveled out. I had reached the crest of the ridge. The wind was stronger up here, tearing shreds in the fog, offering fleeting, nightmarish glimpses of the valley below. I found a cluster of gnarled, wind-stunted pines and crouched behind them, peering through the swirling crimson mist. Across the chasm, not more than a quarter-mile away, was scarred rock. It rose from the fog like the tombstone of a god, a sheer wall of granite bathed in the apocalyptic light of the blood moon. The eclipse was nearing totality. The last sliver of the sun vanished, and the moon, now fully engulfed in Earth's shadow, hung in the sky like a baleful, bloodshot eye. It wasn't just red. It was a pulsating, living crimson that seemed to drip light onto the landscape below. And as I watched, frozen in a state of primal awe and terror, I saw what my grandmother meant. The rock was weeping, but it wasn't water. The great dark fissure that gave Scarred Rock its name began to glow. It wasn't a reflection of the blood-red moonlight. This was an internal luminescence, a sick violet light that pulsed like a diseased heart. The air grew heavy, thick with a static charge that made the fillings in my teeth ache and the hairs on my neck stand up straight. There was no sound, not even the groan of shifting rock. The event was utterly, terrifyingly silent. The fissure widened. It wasn't a geological fracture, not a rock slide. It was an opening, a clean, precise tear in the fabric of the mountain, in the fabric of reality itself. It opened like a wound. From the inside, there was no burst of light or energy. Instead, what spilled out was a tangible, absolute darkness. It was a patch of pure nothing, a hole in the world that seemed to drink the grotesque moonlight, swallowing it without a trace. The blackness was so complete it felt like it had weight, a physical presence that pressed down on the landscape. I felt a wave of vertigo, as if the world were tilting on its axis, and I gripped the rough bark of the pine tree to steady myself. My mind, the rational, scientific mind of Ezra Quaid, simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was like watching a law of physics being repealed. Then they emerged. 3 figures stepped out of the rift of pure night. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly at odds with their horrific appearance. They were tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly thin, their limbs long and spidery. They wore what looked like ceremonial armor, but it wasn't made of metal. It was crafted from blackened, interlocking bones and stretched, leathery hides that seemed to writhe and shift as if still alive. Their faces were obscured by helmets fashioned from the skulls of some great horned beast, its empty eye sockets staring out into our world. They stood there for a moment on the ledge, motionless silhouettes against the bloody moon, surveying the forest as if they owned it. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were paralyzed. My fingers were locked around the stock of my rifle, but the thought of using it was absurd. What was a tranquilizer dart against a nightmare made flesh? This was the source of the silence, the reason the forest was holding its breath. This was what Dylan and Marissa had stumbled upon. As I watched, paralyzed with a terror so profound it felt like a religious experience, the transformation began. The figure on the left, the smallest of the 3, shuddered. Its back arched at an unnatural angle, and a sound like cracking timber echoed across the chasm. The first sound I'd heard since the rift opened. Its long, thin limbs buckled and reformed, the joints dislocating and snapping back into new bestial positions. The bone armor seemed to melt away, absorbed into its flesh as coarse ash-gray fur sprouted from its skin. The horned skull helmet split apart, revealing a long, lupine snout lined with teeth like black glass. Within seconds, the tall, gaunt humanoid was gone, replaced by a creature that stood on 2 legs but was wholly wolf-like in its form. It was a monster from a fever dream, an 8-foot-tall horror of muscle and fur, its eyes glowing with a cold, intelligent blue light. The other 2 followed suit, their bodies breaking and remaking themselves in a symphony of snapping bone and tearing flesh. The largest of them, the one in the center, took the longest. Its transformation was more pronounced, its fur darker, streaked with silver at the massive ruff around its neck. When it was done, it threw its head back, and though it made no sound, I could feel its silent howl in my chest, a vibration of pure dominance and malice that shook the very rock I was hiding behind. The legends were real. My grandmother's stories, my uncle's warnings, they weren't folklore. They were field reports. They were survival guides. These were the hounds, the ash hounds, and they were hungry. Just then, a sound cut through the oppressive silence, so jarring and mundane it felt like a gunshot. It was the crackle of a radio.
A-Day, Mayday, can anyone hear me? This is Dylan Vance. Please, God, somebody answer.
The voice was thin and laced with pure panic, coming from somewhere in the woods between my position and the rock. My blood ran cold. He was alive. He was close. The 3 creatures on the ledge all turned their heads in perfect unison, their movements impossibly fast and synchronized. They looked directly toward the source of the sound. The big one, the leader, tilted its head, a gesture of curious appraisal. There was no bestial frenzy, no immediate charge. This wasn't the mindless rage of a predator. It was something far, far worse. It was the cold, calculating interest of a killer who enjoys the game. The leader let out a low, guttural sound, not a growl, but a series of clicks and whistles. It was a language, an order. The other two hounds leaped from the ledge, a 30-foot drop they took with impossible weightless grace, landing silently on the forest floor below. They didn't run. They began to stalk, melting into the crimson-tinged shadows, their gray forms becoming almost invisible against the rock and trees. The leader remained on the ledge, watching, waiting. It was orchestrating the hunt. My training, my entire life as a ranger screamed at me to act, to radio for help, to fire a warning shot, to do something. But what could I do? I was watching beings that had just stepped through a wound in reality. They weren't from here. They didn't play by our rules. And as I lay there, hidden behind a scraggly pine, a single horrifying thought crystallized in my mind. I wasn't a rescuer. I wasn't even an observer. I was just the next course on the menu. I raised the tranquilizer rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely center the scope's crosshairs. My mind was a maelstrom of denial and terror, but years of training forced a sliver of professional calm to the surface. Target acquisition, breath control, squeeze. I aimed for the center mass of the leader, the big, silver-maned male still standing silhouetted on the ledge. Even if the tranquilizer didn't work, the impact of the dart might do something. It was better than nothing. I held my breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle hissed, a puff of compressed air. I watched the small, feathered dart fly across the chasm, a tiny missile of modern science against an ancient horror. It was a perfect shot. It struck the creature squarely in the chest and passed right through it. There was no impact, no reaction. The dart simply went through the ashhound as if it were made of smoke and vanished into the darkness of the rift behind it. The creature didn't even flinch. It slowly turned its massive head, its glowing blue eyes seeming to look past the fog, past the trees, and directly into mine. It had seen me. It knew I was here. And in that gaze I felt a chilling, contemptuous amusement. My weapon was a toy. My presence was an irrelevance. A woman's scream ripped through the night, sharp and ragged with terror. Marissa. It was cut short with a wet, gurgling sound that made me want to vomit. Then the radio crackled again, but it wasn't Dylan's voice. It was a perfect, chilling imitation of Marissa's. Dylan! Oh God, Dylan, help me, over here! My blood turned to ice. They were playing with them. This wasn't a hunt for sustenance. It was a sport. They were masters of psychological warfare, using the victim's own voices, their own hopes, to draw them into the trap. This was a level of cruelty that transcended animal instinct. This was intelligent, calculated sadism. I could hear Dylan crashing through the underbrush below, his voice raw with panic.
Marissa, I'm coming. Where are you? Here, by the old deadfall. Hurry.
The voice mimicked again, this time from a slightly different direction. They were separating them, corrupting the very tools of communication and trust. I was witnessing a masterfully executed hunt by creatures that had clearly done this 1,000 times before. They weren't just killing their prey. They were savoring their fear, feeding on their despair, before going in for the final strike. Suddenly, Dylan's real voice, not an imitation, came over the radio, so close and loud it made me jump. "It's a trick! Oh God, it's a..." The transmission ended in a sickening crunch of bone and a short, choked cry. Then silence. The real silence this time. The hunt was over. The two hounds emerged from the trees, dragging the limp forms of Dylan and Marissa as easily as if they were dolls. They hauled the bodies to the base of scarred rock, laying them out on a flat, altar-like stone. They were not feeding. They were arranging a tribute. The leader, the Alpha, finally leaped down from the ledge, its landing featherlight for a creature its size. It stood over the bodies for a moment, then let out a series of low, guttural growls. The two smaller hounds bowed their heads in submission. It was a ritual. The Alpha reached down with a three-clawed hand and tore something from Dylan's jacket. His radio. It examined the small black device with an unnerving curiosity, turning it over and over. Then it looked up, its gaze once again sweeping the ridge where I was hidden. It knew. It knew I had a radio too. It knew I had been listening. Panic, cold and absolute, finally broke through my paralysis. I was no longer an observer. The game was over for Dylan and Marissa, and a new one was about to begin. For me. I started to scramble backward, my movements clumsy and loud on the loose scree. A small rock dislodged under my boot, skittering down the slope with a cascade of clicks and rattles that sounded like a drum solo in the dead quiet. All three heads snapped in my direction. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, their glowing eyes locking onto my position with predatory certainty. The Alpha let out a true snarl this time, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the soles of my boots. It was a sound of challenge, of hunger, of promised pain. I turned and ran. I crashed through the stunted pines and plunged down the back slope of the ridge, away from the horrifying tableau at Scarred Rock. The crimson moonlight painted the fog-shrouded forest in shades of nightmare. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, and the terrain was a treacherous mess of rock and mud. I didn't care. I ran with the primal, unthinking terror of a prey animal. The tranquilizer rifle was useless, a dead weight in my hands, but I didn't dare drop it. My Glock felt like a pea shooter. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating a chaotic world of twisted trees and gaping shadows. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Through the swirling red mist, I could see them. They weren't running. They were loping, moving with an effortless, terrifying grace. They flowed over the rough terrain as if it were a flat road, their long limbs eating up the distance between us. They weren't even breathing hard. They were pacing me, enjoying the chase. They knew I had nowhere to go. I was a rat in a maze of their own design. My only hope was to find someplace to hide, some shelter where I could think, where I could try to understand the new rules of a universe that had suddenly declared war on me. And then I remembered the old line shack, my grandfather's hunting cabin. It was less than a mile from here, a dilapidated structure of logs and tin, but it had 4 walls and a door. It was my only chance. My lungs were on fire, each breath a ragged gasp of icy, thin air. Adrenaline and terror were the only things keeping my legs moving. The ashhounds were still behind me, their loping pace a terrifyingly casual pursuit. They were staying just far enough back to let me believe I had a chance, drawing out the fear. The forest, my sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of horrors. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of glowing blue eyes. Every gust of wind sounded like a guttural snarl. Then I saw it, a dark, squat shape through the crimson fog. The line shack. It was more of a hovel than a cabin, built by my grandfather decades ago when he still worked for the logging companies that selectively cleared these hills. It stood in a small clearing, leaning like a tired old man, its log walls silvered with age and its tin roof streaked with rust. To my terrified eyes, it was a fortress. I threw myself at the heavy plank door, my fingers fumbling with the simple wooden latch. It swung inward with a groan of protest, and I stumbled into the single musty room, slamming the door shut behind me. I dropped the heavy crossbar into its iron brackets, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought they would break. For a moment there was only the sound of my own desperate breathing and the frantic thumping of my pulse in my ears. I was safe, at least for a few seconds. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood visits with him. It was a time capsule of a different era. A cast iron stove stood cold in one corner, a stack of dusty firewood next to it. A simple cot with a moth-eaten wool blanket was pushed against the far wall. On a small, rough-hewn table sat a kerosene lamp and a stack of old pulp magazines. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, pine resin, and something else. Something faintly herbal like dried sage. I peered through a grimy crack in one of the shutters. I could see them now, standing at the edge of the clearing. The three of them, motionless as statues, their great wolf-like forms almost beautiful in the hellish red light. They weren't attacking. They were watching, waiting, testing the boundaries of my pathetic little fortress. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. My weapons were useless. The rifle dart had passed through one like it was a ghost. They were ethereal, semi-corporeal. But then I remembered the bodies. They had dragged Dylan and Marissa. They had substance. They had weight. A contradiction. They are not fully of this world, a voice whispered in my memory. My grandmother's voice, telling a story by a fire long ago. Not until they taste the life of the land. Not until blood is spilled under the weeping moon. Blood had been spilled. Dylan and Marissa. Were the hounds solid now? Fully here? I couldn't risk finding out. I needed a different weapon, a different kind of knowledge. My gaze fell upon a heavy, padlocked wooden chest tucked under the cot. My grandfather's chest. He'd always told me never to open it, that it held old things for old troubles. In my pragmatic youth, I'd assumed it was full of antiquated hunting traps or maybe illegal moonshine. Now, it felt like my last and only hope. I found a rusty tire iron by the stove and wedged it into the hasp of the padlock. I put all my weight into it, grunting with effort. The old metal screamed in protest, then snapped. The chest creaked open. The contents were not what I expected. There were no traps, no bottles. Instead, there was a neat bundle of objects wrapped in tanned deer hide. I unrolled it carefully on the dusty floor. Inside was a small leather pouch, a bundle of dried, silver-green leaves tied with sinew, and a thin, leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I opened the journal. The pages were brittle, the handwriting a mix of elegant, old-fashioned English, and, on the facing pages, a series of symbols I recognized as the written language of the Salish people. It was my grandfather's voice, speaking to me across the years. "The blood moon is not a light," the first entry read. "It is a thinning. A moment when the veil between our world and the hungry world grows weak. The rift on the scarred land is a wound that never healed, and through it, the ash hounds come to hunt." I devoured the text, my eyes flying across the page. He wrote of the hounds not as monsters, but as a rival tribe, ancient hunters from a dying, barren world. He described their semi-ethereal state, their ability to mimic voices, their sadistic intelligence. "They cannot be harmed by the weapons of the white man," he wrote. "Iron and lead pass through them like mist. They do not fear fire. They are spirit and shadow until they make their first kill. The shedding of warm blood anchors them here, gives them flesh and bone. But even then, their flesh is not like ours. It is an echo, a memory of form. My hope withered. If they couldn't be harmed, what was the point? But I kept reading. But they are not gods. They have rules. They have weaknesses. They can only be wounded by that which is born of the earth's fire and heart. Volcanic glass, obsidian, the frozen fire of the mountain. To them, it is like touching the heart of our world, a poison to their shadow flesh. I looked at the leather pouch. I emptied its contents into my palm. It was a knife. The handle was a simple piece of deer antler, worn smooth with age. The blade was a piece of razor-sharp, flaked black obsidian, its edges shimmering in the lamplight. It was a primitive tool, a museum piece. And according to my grandfather, it was the only weapon on earth that could hurt them. There was more. I picked up the bundle of dried leaves. It was sagebrush, or a local variant the Salish called ghost herb. Burn the ghost herb, the journal instructed. Its smoke confounds their senses. They hunt by sight and sound, but also by tracking the spirit, the warmth of a life. The smoke hides this warmth. It makes you a ghost to them, if only for a short while. Finally, I read the last page, a passage that made my blood run even colder than before. The rift cannot be destroyed, only sealed. It is a lock that requires a key. The key is the blood of a guardian, a descendant of those who first made the pact with this land. Spilled upon the threshold with the old word spoken, it will close the wound, but only until the next blood moon. The price must always be paid. A guardian. He meant his family. He meant my mother. He meant me. A heavy thud against the cabin door jolted me back to the present. Then another. They were testing the wood. A long black claw, sharp as a shard of glass, punched through the planks right next to my head, splintering the old wood. They were solid now. They were anchored. And they were done playing games. The claw retracted, leaving a jagged hole in the door. My heart, which had been a frantic drum, settled into a cold, heavy beat. The fear was still there, a block of ice in my stomach, but the journal had given it shape. I was no longer just helpless prey. I had knowledge. I had a weapon. I had a chance, however slim. The fear was now alloyed with a grim, unfamiliar resolve. They knew I was in here. Sitting and waiting was a death sentence. That door wouldn't hold forever. I had to change the game. I was a ranger. I knew this terrain better than any living human. It was time to stop being the hunted and start using the forest as my own weapon. The first step was to get out of this trap. There was a small shuttered window on the back wall of the cabin, overlooking a steep, wooded slope. It was my only way out. I moved with a new sense of purpose. I took one of the old pulp magazines from the table, tore out a handful of pages, and lit them from the kerosene lamp. I held the burning paper to the bundle of dried sagebrush. It smoldered at first, then caught, releasing a thick, aromatic white smoke. The smell was sharp and clean, cutting through the cabin's musty air. It was the scent of my grandmother's house, a smell I hadn't encountered in 20 years. The smoke wasn't just a tool, it was a memory, a connection. I held the smoldering bundle in one hand, the obsidian knife clutched tight in the other. The pounding on the door grew more insistent, the wood groaning under the assault. They were losing patience. I unlatched the rear shutter as quietly as I could. It swung open with a low squeal that made me flinch. Outside, the world was still a washed-out nightmare of crimson and gray. I took a deep breath, the sage smoke filling my lungs. and slipped out the window, landing softly on the damp earth below. I stayed low, using the cabin itself as cover, and peered around the corner. The two smaller hounds were at the door, tearing at the wood with their claws. The alpha, the silver-maned leader, stood back 20 feet, watching, its head cocked. Its intelligence was palpable. This wasn't a frenzied attack. It was a methodical dismantling of my defenses. Suddenly, the alpha's head snapped up. It sniffed the air, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The sage smoke was working. It was confused. It could no longer pinpoint my exact location by its supernatural senses. It knew I was close, but the smoke was acting like camouflage, scrambling my spiritual signature. This was my chance. While they were focused on the cabin, I faded back into the trees, moving with a ranger's silence. The smoke from my sage bundle swirled around me, a ghostly shield. I needed to separate them. Taking on all three at once was suicide. I had to use my knowledge of the park against them, to turn their own hunt into a series of traps. My mind raced, flipping through a mental map of the terrain. A mile north of here, the Skycomish River narrowed, forcing its way through a deep, sheer-walled canyon. The trail there was treacherous, running along a crumbling cliff edge. Years ago, a small landslide had created a massive, unstable pile of rocks and dead trees, held back only by a few thick roots. We called it the Widowmaker. It was officially closed, a death trap waiting for an excuse. It was perfect. But first, I needed a lure. The alpha, I noticed, was still holding Dylan's radio. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root. I unclipped my own radio from my belt. I took a steadying breath, the sage smoke making my eyes water. "Henderson, do you read me?" I whispered into the handset, my voice a strained imitation of my normal professional tone. "This is Quaid. I'm heading north, toward the old canyon trail. I need immediate backup. I'm being pursued." I didn't wait for a reply. I clicked it off. It was a gamble. I was betting that the alpha, with its chilling intelligence, would understand the words. Backup, pursued. And I was betting it was arrogant enough to respond to the challenge. The reaction was immediate. The alpha let out a sharp, commanding bark. One of the younger hounds, sleeker and seemingly more reckless than the other, broke away from the cabin door and started trotting in my direction. Its movements were confident, almost a swagger. It was coming to silence the call for help. The alpha and the remaining hound stayed by the cabin, as if certain this younger one was more than enough to handle a single terrified human. They had underestimated me. They saw me as prey. They didn't know I had the rule book now. They didn't know the hunter had just become the bait. I turned and ran, not with the blind panic of before, but with a calculated speed, preserving my energy. I kept the smoldering sage close, letting the smoke trail behind me. I could hear it following, the soft thud of its bipedal gait surprisingly quiet on the forest floor. It was toying with me, staying just out of sight, letting me think I was getting away. It didn't know that I was leading it, step by agonizing step, into a trap born of gravity and geology. The game had changed. The board was set, and I was praying I would live to see the checkmate. The chase was a nerve-shredding ordeal. Every snapped twig behind me sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. The hound was a ghost at my heels, a presence felt more than seen. The sage smoke was my only ally, a fragile, swirling veil between me and its senses. It was close. I could hear its heavy, rhythmic breathing now, a sound like wind through a broken pipe. It was letting me get tired, letting the terrain wear me down before it moved in for the kill. Finally, I reached the canyon trail. The path was barely a foot wide, with a sheer rock wall on one side and a 200-foot drop into the churning black water of the Skycomish on the other. The roar of the river was a constant, deafening thunder. In the blood-red gloom, it was a terrifying place. And just ahead, I could see it, the Widowmaker. A massive, precarious pile of granite boulders and shattered logs clinging to the cliffside, waiting. I had to be fast. I scrambled up the slope just above the trail, finding a purchase behind a thicket of alder. From my pack, I pulled my emergency signal flare. It was my only source of intense, sudden light. The journal didn't mention it, but I was gambling that creatures born of a world of shadow wouldn't react well to a sudden, blinding glare. I tucked the smoldering sage into a crevice in the rock, hoping the smoke would continue to mask my position. I held the obsidian knife in one hand and the flare in the other. I waited. My breath held, listening to the roar of the river and the pounding of my own blood. The ash hound emerged onto the path. It moved with an arrogant slowness, its head turning from side to side, its blue eyes scanning the trail ahead. It was a terrifying sight up close. Its fur was the color of cold embers, its muscles bunched and powerful beneath the skin, and its claws, black and sharp as obsidian, clicked softly on the stone. It stopped directly below the Widowmaker, sniffing the air, confused by the lingering smoke but knowing its prey was cornered. Now. I twisted the cap on the flare. It ignited with a deafening hiss and a brilliant flash of magnesium-white light, instantly banishing the red gloom. The hound recoiled, letting out a shriek of what sounded like genuine pain, a high-pitched, tearing sound that was half whistle, half scream. It threw its arms up to shield its eyes, its supernatural senses overwhelmed by the sudden, violent burst of pure light. In that moment of blindness, I acted. With my free hand, I shoved with all my might against the key log at the base of the rock slide. It was a massive, rotted fir, and for a heart-stopping second it didn't budge. I pushed again, my muscles screaming in protest. I felt a deep groan from the earth, the screech of wood and stone. The roots holding the slide in place tore free with a sound like a gunshot. The world dissolved into a chaotic roar that dwarfed the sound of the river. Tons of rock, dirt, and splintered timber cascaded down the cliffside. The ash hound, still blinded, looked up just in time to be engulfed. It was a force of nature unleashed, an avalanche of pure kinetic energy. The creature was thrown from the path like a twig, slammed against the far canyon wall, and then plunged into the churning whitewater rapids below. I watched, panting, as the dark shape was swept away by the current, tossed and battered against the rocks until it vanished into the darkness downstream. I hadn't killed it. I was sure of that. The journal said they couldn't be killed by conventional means, but I had taken it out of the fight. I had wounded it, battered it, and sent it miles away. I had won a skirmish. I had bought myself time. The flare sputtered out, plunging the world back into red-tinged darkness. The silence that followed the rock slide was profound, broken only by the river's eternal roar. I was alone again, but my victory was short-lived. A sound echoed from the direction of the line shack, a sound that froze the marrow in my bones. It was a howl. Not the howl of a wolf, but a long, drawn-out cry of pure, incandescent rage. It was the Alpha. It knew what I had done. It knew I had harmed one of its pack. The second howl that joined it was higher pitched, filled with a sharp, vengeful fury. The female. The hunt was no longer a game. It was no longer a ritual. Now it was personal. They weren't just hunting a human anymore. They were coming to exterminate a threat. I looked at the obsidian knife in my hand. My grand plan had been to divide and conquer, to pick them off one by one. But I had only succeeded in enraging the two most dangerous members of the pack. There would be no more tricks, no more toying with me. They would come for me together, with all their speed and fury. My time was running out. The eclipse was already past its peak. The moon's bloody aura was beginning to fade at one edge. The rift would be closing soon. There was only one path left to me, the one my grandfather's journal had laid out. I couldn't defeat them. But maybe, just maybe, I could lock the door behind them. I had to get back to Scarred Rock. I had to face them at the source. Running back towards Scarred Rock was a fundamentally different experience. Before, I was fleeing from a threat. Now I was running to one. The goal wasn't escape, but confrontation. Every step was a conscious decision, a choice to move toward the heart of the nightmare. The crimson light of the blood moon was waning, a sliver of pure white beginning to appear on the moon's limb. The sky was slowly, almost imperceptibly, lightening. Time was a luxury I no longer had. I could hear them behind me. Not the loping, casual pace of before, but a dead run. They were crashing through the undergrowth with reckless abandon, their rage lending them a terrible speed. The alpha's deep, guttural snarls and the female's higher-pitched shrieks of fury echoed through the trees, a terrifying harmony of vengeance. They weren't trying to be stealthy anymore. They wanted me to know they were coming. They wanted me to feel the terror of their approach. I burst out of the tree line and onto the ridge where I had first seen them. The scene across the chasm was even more hellish up close. The rift in Scarred Rock was still a maw of absolute blackness, but it seemed smaller. The edges were shimmering, contracting, like a wound slowly trying to heal itself. The violet light that pulsed around it was weaker. My grandfather was right. The door was closing. I scrambled down the rocky slope into the basin at the foot of the monolith. The air here was freezing cold, and the ground was littered with a strange black dust that felt like fine ash. The bodies of Dylan and Marissa were gone. The hounds must have dragged them away, or perhaps consumed them. I forced the thought from my mind. In the center of the basin was the flat black stone I'd seen them use as an altar. This was the threshold. This was where I had to make my stand. I had barely reached the stone when they arrived. They emerged from the forest not as two separate beings, but as a single fluid unit of destruction. The female was in the lead, her lithe form a blur of gray fur and lethal intent. Her blue eyes burned with a cold fire. The alpha was right behind her, a towering mountain of muscle and hate. His silver-maned head low, his black glass-like teeth bared. There was no time for a plan, no time for traps. This was it. The female lunged. She moved with an impossible quickness, a horizontal leap that covered 20 feet in a blink. I didn't have time to think, only to react. I dropped to one knee on the altar stone, holding the obsidian knife out like a stake. Her momentum carried her onto the blade. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. The moment the volcanic glass touched her flesh, there was a sound like sizzling fat and a puff of black, acrid smoke. She let out a piercing shriek of agony, a sound of pure disbelief. The obsidian didn't just cut her, it unmade her. A deep, cauterized, smoking gash opened in her shoulder. The wound didn't bleed red blood, but a thick black ichor that steamed and dissolved into nothing as it hit the stone. She was solid. She was vulnerable. The journal was right. The pain drove her into a frenzy. She lashed out with her free hand, the 3 long claws scything through the air. I twisted away, but not fast enough. The tips raked across my ribs, tearing through my jacket and shirt. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in my side. I staggered back, gasping, the world turning gray at the edges. The wound was deep. I could feel the warm, wet rush of my own blood. She prepared to strike again, to finish me. But behind her, the Alpha was closing in, a silent, unstoppable engine of death. He was taking his time, circling around to cut off any escape, his eyes fixed on me with a look of predatory triumph. He was going to enjoy this. My head swam from the pain and blood loss. I was trapped between them. I looked at the female, poised to deliver the killing blow. I looked at the Alpha, his claws extended, ready to rip me apart. And then I looked past them, at the shimmering, shrinking rift in the rock face. The key is the blood of a guardian. There was no other way. It wasn't about winning the fight. It was about ending the war, if only for a generation. Ignoring the female in front of me, ignoring the searing pain in my side, I made the only move they wouldn't expect. I turned my back on them. I turned my back on the fight and faced the portal. It was the ultimate act of surrender, the ultimate act of faith. I took 3 stumbling steps, my own blood leaving a trail on the ashen ground, and stood before the weeping wound in reality. Behind me, I heard the Alpha let out a roar of confused fury. He charged. I could hear his massive footfalls closing the distance. 1 second, maybe 2. It was all the time I had. The Alpha's shadow fell over me, a promise of imminent, absolute annihilation. I could feel the displacement of air as he raised his massive, clawed hand for the final, devastating strike. There was no time to flinch, no time to brace. There was only time for the ritual. With my last ounce of strength, I raised the obsidian knife. It wasn't a weapon anymore, it was a ceremonial tool. Ignoring the tidal wave of pain from my ribs, I drew the razor-sharp edge across the palm of my other hand. The cut was deep, a new, clean line of fire to add to the chorus of agony. My blood, dark and shockingly red against the backdrop of this alien place, welled up instantly. I pressed my bleeding hand against the cold, vibrating stone at the edge of the rift. Then I spoke. The words came from a place deeper than memory, a part of my soul that had been asleep my entire life. They were the words from my grandfather's journal, words in the old Salish tongue I didn't know I could pronounce, let alone understand. They felt ancient and powerful on my tongue, each syllable a resonant note in the strange silence. They weren't a plea. They were a command, the words of a guardian claiming his birthright, his duty.
Go, return. This land is closed.
The moment my blood touched the stone and the final word left my lips, the rock beneath my feet blazed with a soft white light. It was not the violent, sick purple of the rift, but a clean, pure luminescence. The light of a healthy, living world reasserting its dominance. The ground hummed with a deep, powerful energy that resonated through my bones. The rift reacted like a living thing in agony. It let out a deafening, soul-shaking shriek, not of an animal, but of tearing metal and shattering glass, a sound that violated the very laws of acoustics. The aperture of absolute blackness, which had been slowly closing, now slammed shut with impossible speed. It created a vacuum. The female ashhound, still reeling from her obsidian wound and poised to strike me, was caught in the violent pull. She was lifted from her feet, her shriek of pain turning into one of terror as she was sucked backward, tumbling end over end into the collapsing void, Her shape distorted, stretched, and then she was gone, consumed by the closing wound. The alpha, his claws just inches from my back, was caught on the threshold. The rift snapped shut directly in front of him, severing his connection to his home world. The sound cut off with a final echoing crack that reverberated through the mountains. Where the gaping maw had been, there was now only solid granite. The deep fissure was still there, but it was just a scar again, a dead thing of rock and shadow, faintly shimmering like a heat haze on a summer road. The alpha stood frozen, stunned by the violent severing. He was trapped, alone, a king exiled in a hostile land. He let out a low, guttural moan, a sound not of rage this time, but of loss, of dawning horror. And then the sun broke through. The first true rays of dawn crested the eastern peaks, lancing through the dissipating fog. The grotesque, bloody light of the eclipse was vanquished, replaced by the clean, golden light of a new day. When that sunlight touched the alpha's fur, he recoiled as if struck. He hissed, a plume of black smoke rising from his skin where the light touched him. The sun of our world was anathema to him, a poison. Weakened, cut off from the source of his power, and wounded by the light, he did the only thing he could. He retreated. With one last look at me, a look of pure, undiluted hatred that promised a future reckoning, he turned and melted into the deepest, darkest shadows of the old-growth forest. I was alone. I slumped to my knees, the obsidian knife clattering to the ground beside me. The pain in my side was a roaring fire, and my hand was a bloody mess. My clothes were shredded. My body was battered, but I was alive. I looked at my bleeding palm, at the blood that had sealed the gate. The blood of a guardian. The night was over. The silence that returned to the forest was different now. It was the old silence, the peaceful silence. I could hear a bird tentatively begin to sing, then another. The world was waking up, cautiously returning to life. But I knew this wasn't an end. It was a beginning. I was no longer just Ezra Quaid, park ranger. My skepticism had been burned away in a single night of impossible horror, leaving behind a hard, cold certainty. The old stories were true. The monsters were real. And one of them was still out there, hiding in the shadows of my park, nursing its hatred, waiting for the sky to bleed again. I picked up the obsidian knife, its black surface cool against my skin. My grandfather had been a guardian. My mother had carried that bloodline. Now it was my turn. The job description had just changed. I was the keeper of the quiet, the watcher on the trail. I was the guardian of Cascade Whisper, and my watch had just begun.